Okay, we're at 12:03, so we're going to go ahead and start. We still have people joining, but we've got a critical mass now. So I want to welcome everyone to People and Places, the forgotten story of Rancho Los Amigos. I am Adrian Scott Fine. I'm the Director of Advocacy for the Los Angeles Conservancy. We hope you all are already members of the Conservancy or will be joining us soon, as we really greatly value and appreciate your support. And it's really you that helps us save LA's heritage, so thank you. We have about 200 folks signed up today, which is fantastic, and thank you. Thank you for being here, as this will be an interactive opportunity to both learn more and talk more about how you can help save an important, though quite honestly, little known LA historic place. So for the next hour, we're going to share the story of the South Campus of Rancho Los Amigos in Downey. It started as a county poor farm, its evolution as a rehabilitation hospital, its role in another infectious disease epidemic, similar to what we're experiencing now, and how this decades-long vacant hospital campus is now planned for nearly wholesale demolition by the County of Los Angeles. We'll also have an opportunity for you all to ask questions and hear how you can press the county and the Board of Supervisors for a greater preservation and adaptive reuse approach rather than what's currently proposed. As planned, nearly 60 historic buildings are set for demolition, resulting in the destruction of the historic district. So I would encourage you to get your questions ready. Feel free to add them to the Q&A box function at the bottom of your screen. We will have a specific set aside time for Q&A, so get ready for that. But to begin and to help tell us our story, I want to welcome Hadley Mears as our guest. Hadley is a Los Angeles-based historical journalist and tour guide who writes for outlets including Vanity Fair, The Hollywood Reporter, and Curbed LA. She also hosts a podcast, Underbelly LA, and the mini podcast, Happy History. I was telling her earlier, they're highly addictive. I highly recommend both and learn a whole nother flavor of LA history. In 2015, she wrote a really great piece about Rancho for KCET that especially provides insights on the people behind Rancho, which is a big part of what we're trying to get at and tell the story of the people. So Hadley, welcome.
Thank you.
You also have another claim to fame and something we actually both share. You don't know this, but that's a connection to my home state of Indiana. In your case, through the fictional town of Pawnee, Indiana, and Parks and Recreation. And do you care to share a little bit about what I'm talking about?
I was Amy Poehler's stand-in on Parks and Rec for many years, and that's actually how I was able to start my historical journalist writing career, is because when I wasn't needed on set, I had my computer and I would write my articles and do my research in my chair on set all day. And they all knew that I really wanted to be a writer, so they cut me a lot of slack in terms of showing up for things. So I have Pawnee to thank basically for my career today.
Great. Well, thank you. You're like a celebrity, a Parks and Recreation celebrity. So we've got a twofer here. And it's actually through my growing up, but working in preservation in Indiana, that I actually learned about county poor farms and actually worked to save a couple there. Indiana has 92 counties, and all 92 counties have county poor farms. And it really taught me a lot about these kinds of places and why they came about. And it's very similar to what we have here with LA County, which was managed by the County Board of Supervisors. So with that in mind, we want to give you a little bit of a flavor of the place. And we realize a lot of you have never been there, unfortunately, because it's an experience. And so we're going to share a little bit of what it looks like, the story of the place. And let me share my screen here. Perfect. Do this real quick, sorry. Okay, so let me get started by telling you a little bit about the place and also sharing why Rancho Los Amigos is important and why it matters. In many ways, it provides insights into changing attitudes toward the poor in Los Angeles and California and nationally. And saving and reusing a meaningful part of Rancho Los Amigos and helping the county find and support a win-win approach is really critical. And we believe at the Conservancy that historic preservation has a powerful role to play in telling the story of an often difficult history. And that's certainly part of the story of Rancho Los Amigos. And we cannot do that when we demolish or we choose to only keep bits and pieces of the places that tell the story. So that's really what we're attempting to achieve here. In the early years and start, some believe the intended purpose of poorhouses was, quote, to reform the deviant and turn him or her into a productive citizen. Origins of poor farms, also referred to as asylums or as an almshouse, are a result of the disorganized, quite honestly, very disorganized system of state and local governments, all trying to deal with a growing population of the destitute, the mentally ill, the sick and poor, and not really having a plan in place of what that would look like. So it was really during this era that the only safety net for most elderly people at this time was really their families. Families usually took care of their aged relatives, but this became more difficult with industrialization and people living apart. If families could not support the relatives, many times the only recourse was to go to the poorhouse. Poor farms also were determined in many parts of the US to be the most economical and effective way of providing for the poor, and for some, improving their moral character. Here, residents were initially referred to not as patients, but as inmates. Now, and we're very clear, there's no sugarcoating a place like a county poor farm. These were not always the most humane of places, but that's part of the story. National unemployment rates also indicate part of the need, though some paternalistic leaders at the time ascribed those who applied for relief were poor through moral failings or intemperance with alcohol. The thinking by some was poorhouses would reform poor people, remove them from the temptations of drink and the outside world, and provide food and shelter in exchange for labor. And when we talk about a place like Rancho today, it's more than just a group of old, dilapidated, poorly neglected buildings, which it is, but it's really about the people and the story and how it can be seen and told through the buildings and the place. Here, there are some of the people at Rancho, fully realized in what the LA County Board of Supervisors intended in 1887 to build a new institution that would house homeless, able-bodied people in a beautiful setting. Rancho is ultimately a story about a largely forgotten group of people. With few exceptions, we don't know their names or their individual life stories. Rancho is admittedly a complex story of highs and lows, but a place that provided a safe spot to land when honestly there were few options. And given our growing homeless crisis and housing issue, it's actually a place I think we're going to learn a lot from today. Well, Rancho was isolated. It was not hidden away from the larger LA community as it is today. Rancho was something to be proud of and established a strong track record of success. So you had service organizations like 4-H and others who regularly visited Rancho. The picture on the right is probably from the 1940s of a service organization of women who came to visit, in this case, providing tobacco to some of the patients there. In addition to working the farm and growing products, early residents also produced products, in this case, furniture. They were also trained in ceramics, printmaking, rug weaving, a number of other kind of trades and skills. Rancho today, the Rancho of the 2020 is really a ghost town of what it used to be. It's empty, it's boarded up without signs of life. Yet if you look throughout the entire campus, there are signs and reminders everywhere that this was a place ultimately about people. It absolutely can be again, we believe firmly, without needlessly throwing this place away. And we'll touch on that a little bit later about what's going on today. But this gives you a sign of what Rancho initially looked like when it opened in 1888 on 124 acres of farmland in what is now Downey. 3 or 4 buildings formed an initial quad of the initial poor farm, 2 1888 buildings flanking on each side. At the center is an 1889 building, and at the left you'll see the original water tower. This is a 1902 map of Rancho. Here you get a much better sense of the original plan that quickly expanded outward, along with the growing need for persons living at Rancho. By the 1890s, over 200 people were here. It was during this time that they built a new women's ward. This was a campus of beautiful trees, fountains, and landscaping, as well as a working farm, raising row crops, chickens, hogs, dairy herds, and sheep. The orange grove itself covered 32 acres. And by 1908, the farm had grown to 333 acres in size. It's really in this visual from 1926 aerial that you can see the rancho that looks much more like the rancho that still exists today. So if you see with this additional visual of an early site plan of rancho, and then you see the two areas highlighted in blue, that's a row of infirmary ward buildings, just to give you some context and orientation of the site. The main drag through the site was Eucalyptus Ave, south of Imperial Avenue. As you came in, I believe it's called maybe Erickson, I believe today. And then north of Imperial is what is now the North Campus of Rancho Los Amigos. And here's a 1929 view. That's that same row of infirmary ward buildings. By the 20s, nationally, there was more emphasis on administering the poor farm to provide proper care of the residents, as opposed to operating the farm to maximize its productivity or being self-sufficient. It was during this time that was transitioning primarily from a poor farm to a healthcare rehabilitation function. And if you look at this visual, there's a number of signs that show how it was very progressive at the time and what it was serving. So you see a number of people in wheelchairs throughout the site, early use of ramping. This was not a site that was closed off from the public could come. So it wasn't an institution as some might perceive it to be. It was really a place where people could convalesce and rehabilitate, and really was progressive in some of the ideals that it was trying to address in terms of healthcare at the time. This is the same row of buildings of the infirmary ward buildings as they look today. All these buildings are set for demolition with the current plan. One of the defining elements of many poor farms was their operation by superintendents who lived with their families on the premises. William R. Herriman came to Rancho in 1915 at age 26 and stayed until 1952, living in this large craftsman-style residence at the center of the property. And Herriman was a real progressive, priding himself on knowing everyone's name at Rancho and greatly expanding this facility. I love this quote of his here. I read something else about him where he talked about, or it was talked about, that he would bring fresh cut flowers when he would go present before the Board of Supervisors. Maybe it's something we could employ again today if we were actually in person versus virtual for next week during their meeting. By the mid-20s, the staff was about 242 employees and the patient population was just under 1,200. So you've seen it has grown a lot. Of those, about half were classified as chronically ill at the time. This is the Herriman residence around 2012. This is the same residence in June of 2017 on fire, set ablaze through arson. This is the building as it exists today. This is, was individually eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. This is also set to be completely demolished from the ruins that exist today. Increasingly, poor farms at the time were being called, or changing their naming, or they're being called county homes or county infirmaries to remove really the public stigma associated with being sent to the poorhouse or the asylum. Superintendent Herriman went one step further here, initially in 1918 by calling it Hondo for the Rio Hondo, which ran through the property. But in 1932, he officially changed the name to Rancho Los Amigos, or Friends of the Ranch. What you're seeing here is the men's psychopathic ward. It's a series of identical structures that exist on a quad of the property. This is what it looks like today. There's a grouping of these buildings. And here you can see another building, one of these ward structures that is another building, a victim of arson fire in the last couple of years. These are all set to be demolished as well. This is the original power plant, 1913 water tower, and then to the left here is a laundry. Up until last month, this was set for demolition other than the water tower, and we're very pleased that the county has revised its plan somewhat. So now the power plant will be retained and reused. The laundry building will be retained and mothballed, and the water tower will be retained. Here you get a good sense of kind of the view of an early view of Rancho with these these buildings with the open porches, and you also see at the right-hand side of the screen some of the original buildings while they still existed. And flash forward to present, these are the buildings as they exist today. There's an entire grouping of these buildings. They're all set to be demolished through the current plan by the county. By the 1930s, there was a shift in architecture and the design to some degree, 20s and 30s really, to more of a Spanish colonial revival style. So this is a hospital building from 1930 under construction and its completion. Here's a 1926 Spanish colonial revival style administration building that fortunately still exists, and this is not set to be demolished, so this will be retained. This is currently operated, I believe, by Sheriff's Operations. Casa Consuelo was a new women's ward built in 1930 to house 188 female patients. Featured things like sun porches, courtyards, parlor and day rooms, all with the idea to allow the women that were there convalescing to sit, read, and visit. And this is the building as it exists today. It's been in this condition for some time. Initially, this was to be only mothballed by the county's plan. Again, as we learned last month, this will now be reused, which is progress. Again, we believe if we can add some more buildings into the preservation zone of this proposed project, that will be progress overall in terms of achieving greater preservation. Herriman also believed for the people that were at Rancho that it was important to repair one's spirit as well as one's body. So there was an auditorium providing a place for entertainment. This is as it looked originally. And then you'll see here as it looks today, sort of a 1930s makeover. This is set to be demolished. This is a 1929 occupational therapy building, as you see, completely encased in vegetation. This is also to be demolished, one of many, many buildings to be demolished through the current plan. By the 1930s, Rancho had grown significantly with over 2,700 residents, or still called at that time inmates, and providing food for the needy beyond just the farm itself, filling a substantial need given this was the Depression era. Rancho now encompassed 540 acres. The staff size was around 700 at this time. Here's another grouping of buildings also set to be demolished. County poor farms were greatly impacted by the passage of the Federal Social Security Act in 1935. Many of those living in county homes were able to leave and live elsewhere with their Social Security payments. By this time, the makeup of Rancho's population shifted somewhat to other poor migrant farmers moving into California, especially those moving here from Dust Bowl states. Also, the farming operations were being phased out by this time. By the 1940s, two Rancho headlines were about, in one case, 3 bears at Rancho, and in the other case, about a breathing technique to help the polio victims, many of them that were coming to Rancho at that time. The first part of the story, the 3 bears, I don't know enough about this, and maybe Hadley does, and she can fill us in shortly, but it was Red, Spot, and Blackie. By the time this article was published in '43, it was just Red and Spot, and they had been here for about 10 years at Rancho. Switching to the other article, by the late 40s and early 50s, the US was experiencing a surge in polio outbreaks, including LA County. Rancho ultimately played a key role in the fight against polio. Like COVID-19, there were no known vaccines at the time for this infectious disease. Polio was also referred to as the invisible enemy, with the virus spreading through person-to-person contact. Social distancing was also employed, as were travel and commerce restrictions in hot zones. And here you see it in action at Rancho. The difference between now and then is polio primarily affected the young. Children who could catch the virus and ultimately experience death or paralysis and a lifetime of crutches, wheelchair, are being placed in an iron lung, as you see here. During the summer season, polio flared up with swimming and wading pools, feared especially as transmitters for the virus. Again, Rancho played a critical role. As you can see here, kids that were at Rancho, both in the South and the North Campus. And then the picture on the right, a little terrifying. Not sure if a clown would soothe my nerves, but maybe there was different times then in terms of how people felt about clowns visiting you in the Iron Lung. And to address the growing epidemic, Rancho adapted its focus in the mid-1940s and the operation as a polio respiratory center, expanding to the northern campus and eventually becoming one of the leading post-polio respiratory centers in the world. In 1957, agricultural production halted as the campus transitioned to a permanent hospital facility. Gradually, the South Campus of Rancho declined, almost entirely abandoned or only used for storage by the early 1990s. Today, the primary residence of Rancho is a feral cat colony. And since the 1980s, Rancho has been on a steady decline with a systematic approach of demolition by neglect employed by the County of Los Angeles. In recent years, contributing buildings within the historic district have been destroyed due to neglect, vandalism, and a recent spate of numerous arson fires. The current deteriorated conditions and neglect which have occurred under the county's stewardship are now cited by the county as a health and safety concern and justification in part for the proposed nearly wholesale demolition of the historic district. Simply, they cite their own self-inflicted neglect as the reason for why demolition is needed at this time and is seen as a nuisance. So this gives you a better sense of what's proposed now. For well over a decade, the Conservancy has been working closely with various county representatives in regards to various proposals that have come forward. During this time, Rancho has been listed on the California Register. It's also been determined eligible as a National Register Historic District. So what you see in the map right here are all the buildings and resources that make up the Rancho Los Amigos Historic District with this boundary of the red line. The buildings that are in this kind of striped zone or the elements, those are the ones to remain. So you've got the power plant that I showed you earlier that's located here, the water tower, the laundry building, the Casa Consuelo, and the administration building. And this is the Morton Bay fig tree. Everything else is to be demolished under the current proposal. This gives you a better sense of the project area, and one of our concerns that we've raised through the environmental review process is that it's a 74-acre site where the proposed new construction is 35 acres, yet everything else is to be demolished even though there isn't a proposed project impacting some of the additional buildings, and we've raised that concern. This gives you a view again of the site. Again, these elements are the only ones to be preserved. Everything else is to be demolished. We strongly believe there's a win-win scenario available to the county where both preservation and new construction is possible. We believe the opportunity exists to modify the county's plans by pairing both new construction with adaptive reuse. It's an approach that has been successful elsewhere, in this case in San Diego, in DC, also in Vermont, and even in Los Angeles at the Hercules campus. And that's very much what we've been pushing for. We question why the county is investing funding in a massive operation and expansion of county, including a probation headquarters and other county administrative offices during this time when other pressing community needs are great and resources are limited. So if you've gone to our website, you've probably seen a little bit about what's going on, but this is what's happening. It goes to the County Board of Supervisors next Tuesday in terms of a vote that is seeking approval by the county representatives for nearly wholesale demolition, over 100 buildings, nearly 60 of those which are historic, to be demolished as part of this proposal. Now, I would encourage you to go to our website, visit this, learn what you can do. We'll talk more about this a little bit later. Some of you have already written letters, and we really appreciate that, reaching out to the County Board of Supervisors. From our perspective, Rancho Los Amigos and all it represents to our past and present is deserving of a better fate than demolition. and we really need your help to convince the county that we can do better. So we'll come back to this. I'm now going to shift and go back to Hadley. So Hadley, if you want to unmute yourself.
Okay.
So what did I miss, Hadley? What did I leave out? What did I get wrong?
Oh, you got everything right. That was fascinating. I learned so much, especially I hadn't really realized what a national trend and movement poor farms really were, which I think is really fascinating and something we could be thinking about a lot today with our current houseless crisis on our hands. What I was really fascinated about, I went there first in 2015. I believe I'd heard about it. My friend Sandy Himmerline, who writes a great blog called Avoiding Regret and writes for KCT. She's the SoCal Wanderer. I believe she had covered the Rancho, and I was like, what is this? I have to go check it out. And my friend and I went one day, and it was the first thing I thought, and this was in 2015 when homeless issues weren't in the forefront of my mind, was this would be such an amazing place to give people homes who are currently living in really rough conditions, like on Skid Row and in other parts of Los Angeles. I was like, this is a brilliant idea that could be brilliant again. And one of the first things you see when you enter the grounds is how beautiful it is. I mean, they really did. They had a farm there. They had a bunch of prize cows there. They were very famous for their cows. They had chickens, they had pigs, they had those bears, they had a whole menagerie of animals. I even found one article about them trying to grow tobacco on the land. So they really were attempting to be a self-sustaining community. That never really happened. I don't believe they ever. Colleen, who wrote the wonderful book about Rancho, could probably answer that better. But they really tried to have a whole model of self-sustainment. And the grounds are still just so lush and gorgeous, even to this day, as these buildings are just slowly being left to fall apart. And I just kept thinking about how walking by these dormitories, God, the life stories in every one of the beds. They said they had kind of wrought iron white beds and little tiny stands that they would decorate to try and make it feel like home. And that was these people's whole world. And within those people was a whole world. And I wish that there was more to honor the history of all these really fascinating Californians who ended up at Rancho Los Amigos.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you walk the grounds, you know, it's not ghosts, but there's certainly the people that were there that are just calling out. You got to guess. There's got to be 1,000 different stories. Some of them heartbreaking stories in terms of the people that ended up there. Can you share a little bit about, and your piece with KCT was great about sharing some of the individuals that were associated with Rancho.
Absolutely. You know, one of the fascinating things about Rancho is that it really did come out of, in a lot of ways, decades before the gold rush, because you had all of these single young men rushing out to California thinking, I'm going to make my fortune. And then they come out here and that doesn't happen. And they're, you know, thousands of miles from their family. And a lot of them were unskilled laborers. And so they are starting to get older in the 1880s when the poor farm is established. You also have in the 1870s and 80s, tons of folks coming out to California because of all the boosterism, very much propagated by the LA Chamber of Commerce, saying, come to Southern California. This is the bastion of health and wellness, and we'll cure your tuberculosis. We'll cure everything you got. So people spend their life savings to come to Los Angeles, and they're still sick. The air didn't cure them, it didn't work. So you have this confluence of all of these people needing somewhere to stay. And you find that the people who came to stay were so varied. You had a lot of sea captains, you had former slaves, you had I found a lot of references to how there were always an abundance of lady music teachers. This was probably single women who got old and had made their own living, right? And then, because of what society still does to single women, they were kind of pushed aside. There was a story of an African-American gentleman who it was claimed he was 118 years old, which is probably not true. There was a great
It's a good story, though.
but it's a great story. There was a really touching article I found in the Los Angeles Times about two old men who were playing checkers one day. And he bent over and a Carnegie medal dropped out of his pocket. And this was a medal that was given for heroism, for acts of heroic nature. And his friend said, "Oh, I have one of those too." And he took his out of his pocket. And they had both received them because they had happened to save somebody's lives in their former life. And this was a medal given, I'm assuming, by the Carnegie Foundation to honor people who had done extraordinary feats. I have found a couple instances of ex-royalty ending up at the poor farm. Particularly, I believe there was a Russian guy who was in the Imperial Guard. California after World War I was awash with Russian immigrants. A lot of them ended up claiming royalty and being extras in films. That's like a whole other story, and dazzling LA with their supposed credentials. And I found evidence of a countess from Prussia, I believe, who had immigrated to Los Angeles, ended up on the poor farm. There's even into later days, there's an amazing story, and I'm sure Colleen remembers the name, of a mentally challenged man who spent basically his whole life at Rancho Los Amigos. And into the 1970s, he would still be going around from unit to unit, greeting people and saying hello to people and brightening everybody's day. So this was really a home for people. The average stay for people a lot of times was 3.5 years. Mm. So this wasn't just, a homeless shelter. It wasn't just a place, a hospital you went to get better. It was a community for people who didn't have a community. And I think that's such a beautiful idea and such a forward-thinking idea. And it was William Herriman, the superintendent during kind of the golden age, I'd say, of the poor farm, who he made sure to learn every inmate by their first name. And he's the one who decided we are not calling them inmates, we're calling them patients. And he liked to say, this isn't really a hospital, it's more like a small town. So I think you see this very, and again, like you said, we're not whitewashing. I'm sure some questionable stuff went on here. Medicine and psychiatric care has, advanced eons from where it was. But it was really an effort to give these people their humanity back. And I think that's a really important element we can take as a tool to learn today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the other piece to this is, I think a lot of people think of poor farms or asylums as these places that were, and some were, but completely cordoned off from the rest of the community, and people were locked up, and that these were not beautiful places in terms of what they were trying to give back to the people that were there. I mean, from everything that I've been able to glean is Rancho was a beautiful campus in terms of, the landscaping, the lushness of it, and it wasn't a prison, as I think some would equate or think that these places were about in terms of that.
It wasn't a prison. They had pretty much freedom. There's a story of several men, and I believe one dying because they bought illegal liquor in the town of Hondo. And, so there were people with very real problems that were having to manage these problems even if they lived on the farm. And there's one really disturbing story of a woman who had covered all of her body and all of her relief money. So where there was thousands of dollars on her body. And when she came to the farm, they had to, open up her dress and peel the money off of her. So you were dealing with people with a lot of issues. But then you were also just dealing with old folks. And the stigma still remained, because there's one article in the LA Times that's really sad where they talk about all these elderly people there and the women all sitting around sewing and trying to make things nice. But they were terrified to have their picture taken because there was still this stigma attached to this place, even though it was so beautiful. You said poor farm, and suddenly you were considered, a less than forgotten person.
Yeah. Most of the pictures are out there. They're just of men. And
yes.
It leads this perception that it's just a place where it's single men and no women. And that certainly wasn't the case. You've mentioned a couple times Colleen, and we're very fortunate she was able to join us today. I think we're going to be able to have her join here as well, who wrote a book in 1990, kind of a centennial history of Rancho, which is really fantastic and tells a much broader story than certainly anything that we've even attempted to do in our 10, 15-minute thing today. So let me see if I can have you join. Are you there, Colleen?
I am here.
Hey, welcome.
It's under my husband's name.
That's fine.
You can't see me yet, right?
That's fine.
Because my computer is broken down right now, going into the shop. But yes, thank you for having me. I appreciate that. You guys are doing a great job.
Absolutely. So what did what have we not said? Where have we left off? Since you know the history of Rancho probably better than anybody.
Just a few things that might be helpful to you would be, for instance, in occupational therapy. This is one of the things that was the most surprising to me when I did my interviews. The man who had, for instance, come to Rancho, he was a Downey resident, and he repaired shoes for the people there at Rancho, the patients. Little by little, well, there I am.
Hey,
Okay. Little by little, he had people say, I would love to learn how to do this. And that way, when I leave here, you know, someone who had been an alcoholic on the street or who had been injured, say, building the railroad coming through, there were a lot of them there that had broken arms, broken legs, lost fingers in the coupling accidents and things like that. So Caesar said that he then would bring people in and show them how to make shoes. And little by little, he noticed that those arthritic hands or those fingers that were missing, and he had to compensate for the lack of fingers. Or anyway, they wanted to learn how to make shoes, and they did. And a side effect was that it helped their health. It helped their arthritic hands and so forth. Same thing with weaving all of the wicker furniture. The man that was in charge of that workshop, they had to come up with ideas on how they could make money to help keep the poor farm running. So they would put together these wicker chairs and tables and so forth and sell them. And again, side effect, fingers were getting better, minds were getting better, people were loving it. And then they would leave Rancho with an occupation that they could do. So studies began there about that very thing, and it did become what we know today as occupational therapy. It evolved from those humble beginnings into really important things. Same with where they had patients throwing balls, little bits of exercise, and they found out that that physical therapy that they were doing was really helping the people that before that they didn't have such things. And again, it blossomed into yet another division at Rancho for physical therapy. So from these little humble beginnings, I think about all of the things that started there that then became normal later all over at the hospitals and so forth. So for that alone, it's really important to I think, keep at least the memory of it through some of the buildings. And also Casa Consuelo, when I went in there, there were still some people in there. And I mean, that was back in the 80s. And a lot of the women, again, using their fingers, doing the sewing and so forth, it gave them something to do. It gave them hope. And a lot of them were terminal cancer victims. Also on the mental wards, I remember that Herriman, of course, you had the women's ward and you had the men's ward. And when the women first started coming in, I was looking at the patient registers, and some of them had been admitted by their husbands for because they were postpartum or they were depressed or something like that. Some of them was because they were nursing a baby. I mean, it was the weirdest stuff, you know, and of course laws have been passed since then that you have to have a pretty good reason to put your wife in a mental institution. But they were locked in there, and they built courtyards. For the men, it had a gas lighter thing so they could smoke and go get their cigar or their cigarette lit. And the women, it was separate, but they were very lovely and shady, and they made sure that the people actually got out, but they weren't allowed to just wander because, again, they were there for treatment. The other people were allowed the run of the place if they were ambulatory, and it was wonderful. And I walked the paths that they walked, and the trees, as you know, going in are just beautiful. And I do hope they keep those big trees, because that was, I think Herriman wanted that as a symbol of, you are entering a beautiful place, where they planted all those eucalyptus trees along that entryway. Let's see. I also wanted to point out to you that in 2003, I was interviewed by, she was the, one of the reporters, Cecilia Rasmussen. I'm sure you're familiar with her work. Yeah, with her columns. And she did a big piece about the poor farm, about Rancho, and interviewed me in the process. And later she contacted me, and I don't remember the year, but there was a proposal to shut down all of Rancho, not just demolish the South Campus, but the whole thing. It was really on the line. And so she went in and took my book to the judge, and the judge read the book and talked to Cecilia, and she had interviewed me and so forth and so forth. And they saved Rancho because they thought it was such a valuable piece of history, and had done so many valuable things. And then, of course, the hospital at that point was treating spinal cord injuries and burn injuries, and on the other side of the campus. And had we not done that book, and I can't take credit for coming up with the idea because they hired me, the staff at Rancho, to write it, but had they not done that and preserved the history through the book, they might not even exist today. So I just wanted to add that too. It's such an important, this has driven me crazy now for 30 years. Why would they not use that? And I've written a letter that Richard and Kim have to propose using at least a portion of the land and the buildings for the homeless population today. And I don't understand why that's not possible. So.
Hadley, did you have a question?
I have a question for Colleen. Could you maybe tell everyone, because you're talking so much about how much rehabilitative, like basically physical therapy was really flourished at the Rancho. Can you talk to us a little about the 1940s company that was set up to aid in the war effort there? Because I bet people would be interested in that.
Honestly, it's been almost 35 years, and I can't give you details about that, but I do know they had, during World War II, they had guns on the property. And I interviewed a man that they shot when they had those supposed Japanese airplanes come over Long Beach and all of that, and they came inland. They actually shot at the guns from Rancho, with the guns from Rancho. But they had a war effort there. Oh yeah. But do you know about the Japanese who were interred in the barn where the horses were down there at the end? And I can't remember the name of the street. But yeah, they were actually kept there when they started taking the Japanese out of their homes, and kept there until, I guess, Manzanar was ready or something like that. They were there for quite a while. They weren't treated badly, but they slept in the old horse barn. They also had, as you probably know, Hadley, was it the Percheron, the horses? They were like Clydesdales, and they would take them out and they would trot them around in parades and Downey and things like that. And they sold in the dairy section. I actually interviewed the guy who had run the dairy, Frank Moore, I think was his name, and he was quite old when I interviewed him. And he talked about the cheese, how good the cheese was that they really made from the milk of the cows. And he talked about 1918, was it the hoof and mouth disease in 1918? I'm trying to remember the year, maybe it was 1913. but they tried so hard to keep it from the farm because they loved those cows. They just loved them and had names for them. And when the cars would come in or people would come in, they had vats of some kind of a disinfectant that the cars would have to roll through, and the people would have to put their shoes in to try to keep any germs out, and yet it got in. And so the chapter in the book, I think, is called The Day the Farm Cried, and they dug these big pits, and they took all the cows at the same time and killed them all and put them in the pit because they couldn't do anything to save them. And I mean, the nurses that I talked to that remembered it, and the staff, they just sobbed. The worst day ever. So anyway, oh, and I was going to show you my copy. This was the book that they gave me, and embossed with gold. Isn't that pretty?
Very nice.
Gorgeous.
Thank you, Colleen. We're so happy that you're able to join us and give us more insights into this. We've got a number of questions of people. I know we're not going to get to all of them, but I just want to be able to answer some of these questions, or at least put them on there. One of the questions was Rancho Los Amigos ever racially segregated? This is a question we asked ourselves and we weren't sure. That's a no. Okay. There's a question, was there a cemetery on site?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
It's lost, I believe, right, Colleen? It's lost.
The bodies, after the river flooded, it started washing the bodies away. And so they had to get the body parts back that they could, and then they moved them to another cemetery, the ones that were left. But yeah, it's no longer there.
Someone's asked what the name of your book is, Colleen, again, so if you could say the name for everybody. So.
Oh, well, pretty self-descriptive. Rancho. This doesn't have the cover on it. This is the one my husband had in his hands. It's just a centennial book, Rancho Centennial. They're out of print, so there's a few odds and ends of them online.
Okay, great.
But it's a big fat one.
Thank you. There's another question. Is the intended erasure of Rancho a public-private partnership driven by private interests in the county board? I can probably answer that. It's not. This is entirely proposed by the county through the Board of Supervisors as the authorizing entity, but it's a county-driven effort that would house around 3,000 county administrative workers, office workers at the site, both for the probation and other county administrative functions at the site. So we've actually proposed that as a way to find other uses for the other historic buildings, that the county actually pursue public-private partnership model that could adaptively reuse some of the buildings that the county doesn't currently have a plan or reuse for those. Those are similar to some of the other models that we pointed to in the PowerPoint as they've been successful in San Diego or other places in terms of how to make both a public-private funding partnership viable for this site. So right now there is no private piece. It's entirely by the county that's driving this. Someone's asking about what happened to all the medical records for the patients from the 20s to the 40s. You have them? Colleen has them?
No. After I finished, I turned back. Geez, that's a really long story, but there were no records in one place. I had to gather things from all over the place, and sometimes from private individuals. They would donate them and so forth. So I turned it all back into Rancho, of course, and they had a little tiny library, and the journals and all of that were there at that time. And then they eventually tore down that building. It was on the other side of the highway, a little library, and I don't know what happened, but I was told that they went from there to County USC, and then from there, they should be at the Downey Library now in a collection there at USC. So you have to make appointments to go and look in the boxes and that kind of thing. That's the last I've heard anyway.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, are you able to visit Rancho now? Go ahead. Hadley's probably the most recent visitor. You're on mute.
We did this a couple years ago and drove around.
Me?
No,
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 Heather, right?
Hadley.
Yeah.
I think she's.
Heather, it's fenced.
Oops. Now we're all muted. Sorry, Colleen, you're muted at the moment. Hadley, are you back?
Can you hear me?
can-
I think so.
I can hear you.
Okay, great. I went a couple days ago just to check it out because I hadn't been in a couple years, and it is entirely fenced off. So there's a fence everywhere, but you can walk the perimeter. So you can still see the buildings, you can see the beautiful grounds, but you just can't get in, even though there are holes in the fence everywhere. But I did not go into the fence. But you can walk around there and still kind of get a sense of how beautiful it was. But the buildings, I was telling Adrian, are so much worse than they were the last time I was there. There are so many more that look partially burned. There are so many more falling down. I didn't see nearly as many cats as I have usually seen when I go there. So it really, really is in disarray. And there were police, I saw like 4 police cars kind of tracking the area the whole time I was walking, which was creepy. And with all that's going on, I thought very, very strange that they would choose to be there. So yeah, you can still go and walk the perimeter. If you don't want to get arrested, don't go inside.
Right.
They were doing ghost hunts that day too when I was there.
Yeah.
Oh,
Ghost
really?
hunting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we really don't recommend trespassing into the site. I had a
No.
question for Hadley, because I know we're getting close to time here. You often write about stories of people kind of on the fringe or the darker side of LA history, or people that don't get really the due. Can you share a little bit about why you do that, or what is it about that? And certainly that's part of the story of Rancho. It's about people that their story has never been told.
I think one of the main reasons that I'm so interested in the kind of fringe people or people who have been pushed aside by society is just having, honestly, it's a selfish thing, always kind of having felt like an outsider. It's a way, I really believe we can connect with humanity when we learn stories from the past. And I also have always found that the most interesting thing in a historic book is often not the chapter heading or the opening paragraph. It's one little line about a person that seems random, like 8 paragraphs in. And that person usually has an entire amazing story that has been totally lost to time, but kind of besides becoming a footnote. And I think California and Los Angeles in particular, what has really attracted me to LA and the stories of our African American community, of the community of Skid Row, of the community of all the actors who didn't make it, what happens to them, is that we are a community of people that so many people come out here to try and reinvent themselves and to escape their past. And in escaping your past, it doesn't really work. You really can't, you can change who you are, but you can't always change who you are inside. And I find something really beautiful, though, about this LA dream of trying to come out here and trying to break a historic pattern, perhaps, in your life. And I just think that it's something in humanity we can all relate to and connect to. And I want to give, voice to the voiceless people. Gloria Steinem said something about women's history that we'll spend the next 2,000 years rewriting the last 2,000 years because it was so centered on white patriarchal male views. So I kind of try and just find stories of people I think have been unrepresentative. And I take a lot of selfishly, I take a lot of personal solace in that. I think about when I was doing the Poor Farm research, I found a great thing. I think it's in your book, Colleen, and I also found it in an article about they had a band that would go around and play and walk up and down all through the Poor Farm and play. And William Herriman's son, who became a jazz musician, said he would play with all of these inmates. And that's how he kind of learned to love music and learned about being in a band. And how beautiful is that? All these people with nowhere else to go getting to do something as amazing as creating music together. I think that's just so beautiful and just makes me want to cry with everything going on now. History is an amazing thing.
Well, we couldn't agree more. I mean, that's a big part of why we wanted to do this program today, is because we realize the story of Rancho is not a well-known story. It's not a place that most people in LA have ever been to or even knew it existed, let alone what a poor farm was and its origin and why it came about, or the stories about people like Herriman or the woman that pasted money all over her body. Those are rich stories, rich LA stories that never get told. And if we lose a place like Rancho, it's very hard to make that story come alive when you can't see, can't touch, can't experience the place. So that's really the heart of why we're doing this today. There's another question that kind of feeds into that is about someone's asking, what is the likelihood that the current plan will get enough votes to pass? Isn't the EIR public comment period over? So yes, the EIR, the Environmental Impact Report period ended in November of last year in terms of accepting public comments at that time. It is set to go to the Board of Supervisors for a vote and certification of the EIR next Tuesday. Anything's possible. That's in our world, it's all about advocating and making the case and trying to convince decision makers that maybe there's an alternative here. What we're really pressing for is meaningful preservation of Rancho. Right now, we have a few buildings and a water tower and a tree. That doesn't accurately or meaningfully tell the story of Rancho. And there's probably more that could be preserved, maybe not everything, but there is an opportunity for a win-win and to achieve greater preservation and adequately tell the story of this place. If we erase all the components, all the ward buildings, all those structures that really tell the story of the people, we've missed the mark. And so that's why we're really encouraging everybody to write your county board of supervisor, attend the meeting next Tuesday morning. All of this is on our website at laconservancy.org. Step by step, what you can do, how you can participate, how you can make a case, and really do all we can to convince the board of supervisors that there's an alternative, there's a win-win opportunity here other than what's being proposed right now, and that people care. I think the fact that many people haven't stepped in on this is because people just don't know the place and they haven't been involved. And this has been a very quick process, very much kind of undercover, or certainly not as public as it could have been. So we encourage you to do that. We're at the end of our time. We will continue to try to answer questions because we've got way more questions that we can possibly answer during our hour period here. But I do want to thank Hadley for taking part in this, for writing the article in 2015, which is great, doing that research, and Colleen for writing your book, which has been the basis for so much research that I've read, and that you really uncovered the story of this place, and that we don't let it just go down in history without people knowing about it, and knowing what these buildings, they're more than just buildings, they're about people's lives, many people's lives. So I want to thank you for taking part in this. We really appreciate it. And thank everybody for joining us today. We'll again try to get to all these questions. We really appreciate it, your interest in this. And again, go to our website to learn more about what you can do, how you can participate, how you can support our other efforts at the Conservancy. Again, we appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us today. Thank you.